Marhaba, ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome to the Center for Security, Race and Rights lecture on the West, Israel and settler colonization, the West, Israel and settler colonization of Palestine, featuring renowned international scholar Joseph Massad. The Center for Security, Race and Rights is the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school committed to research, advocacy, and public education on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States, as well as international events that affect their rights in the U.S. and abroad. We are proud to be housed at the Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. Rutgers Law School has a proud history of defending the rights and the lives of the underprivileged, the oppressed, and the censored. For more information about our important work, please visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find our programs to be beneficial and you support our work, we ask that you make a financial donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. Our gathering today on December 4th, 2023, occurs amidst an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where in the state of Israel for nearly 8 weeks has been carpet bombing residential neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, churches, and mosques in North, Central, and South Gaza, where more than 2.3 million Palestinian civilians are trapped in a 25-mile by 5-mile strip of land that has been under blockade by the Israeli government since at least 2006. As of today, more than 16,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed by the Israeli military. 40,000 Palestinian civilians have been injured by the Israeli military, and more than 5,000 Palestinians are missing under the rubble of residential buildings indiscriminately bombed by the State of Israel. Despite mass protests in the United States and other Western nations demanding a ceasefire, the U.S. Congress and President Biden unconditionally support Israel's war crimes that include systemic starvation, dehydration, and destruction of the health care system that have caused some genocide scholars to describe Israel's actions and intent as genocidal. Indeed, the United States has funded Israel's military with $3.8 billion of U.S. taxpayer money per year for over 50 years. And Biden is currently asking for an additional $14 billion of Americans' money to allow Israel to execute its plan to maximize Palestinian deaths and ethnically cleanse any remaining living Palestinians to Egypt. This dystopian state of affairs prompts many questions, some of which are not new to those who have studied settler colonial states, systems of racism, and Western Orientalism in the Middle East. Thus, we are honored today to host Columbia University Professor Joseph Massad to assist us in understanding the complex interdisciplinary dimensions of what some have called the Second Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, taking place before our very eyes. Joseph Massad is professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University. He teaches courses on modern Arab culture, psychoanalysis in relation to civilization and identity, and gender and sexuality in the Arab world, and Palestinian-Israeli politics and society, with seminars on nationalism in the Middle East as idea and practice, and also on Orientalism and Islam. Professor Massad's research interests center around theories of identity and culture, including theories of nationalism, sexuality, race, and religion. Professor Massad has published numerous highly acclaimed books, including Desiring Arabs, published in 2007, which was awarded the Lionel Trilling Book Award, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Essays on Zionism and the Palestinian Question, published in 2006, and Colonial Effects, The Making of National Identity in Jordan, published in 2001. Professor Massad's latest highly acclaimed book is Islam in Liberalism, which was published in 2015 by the University of Chicago Press and has been the subject of several forums and symposia. Professor Massad's academic articles have appeared in many journals, including Public Culture, Interventions, Social Texts, Middle East Journal, Psychoanalysis and History, Critique, Umbra, Cultural Critique, and the Journal of Palestinian Studies. Professor Massad also writes frequently for Al-Ahram Weekly, Al-Akhbar, Al Jazeera English, and Electronic Intifada. Professor Massad is a regular contributor to the London-based online publication, Middle East Eye. And honestly, I could go on for many more hours about his wonderful and remarkable academic accomplishments. But today we're here to hear his unique and in-depth perspective on what is happening in Palestine and how to put that into broader theoretical frames. Professor Massad, thank you so much for joining us today, and the virtual floor is yours. Marhaba.
Ahlan. Thank you so very much, Sahar, for inviting me, and thank you for the Center on Security, Race and Rights at Rutgers Law School for inviting me. I am very honored to be here on this very distressing occasion. But nonetheless, I hope to perhaps shed some light in the lecture that I will give today on some of the background to what is happening in Gaza, and also in the hope that I can perhaps chip away at the argument of exceptionalism, the idea that there is something exceptional either about Israel or the Palestinians. So by the way, I'm getting messages that some people say the link isn't working, so I'm not really sure, but I suspect people have already logged in. All right.
Okay. Go ahead.
On October 8th, the second day of war between the Palestinian resistance and the Israeli colonizers, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin ordered the American aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, the most advanced in the U.S. arsenal, to sail to the Eastern Mediterranean in support of the Israeli colonial settler and apartheid regime against the Palestinians. The Ford hosts a guided missile cruiser and 4 guided missile destroyers. The U.S. also dispatched the USS Normandy, a guided missile cruiser armed with naval guns, and destroyers the USS Thomas Hudner, the USS Ramage, the USS Carney, and the USS Roosevelt. Austin added that the Biden administration, and I quote him, will be rapidly providing the Israel Defense Forces with additional equipment and resources, including munitions. The first security assistance will begin moving today and arriving in the coming days, unquote. Since then, many more US ships, advisors, soldiers, and munitions have been dispatched to the apartheid state or to the Middle East more generally, including 2,000 pounds bunker buster bombs for use against the Palestinian people in Gaza. This is not the first time the US or European ships have been dispatched to protect white colonists in Palestine. When a group of white American Protestant fanatics known as the Dixons established the American mission colony in Jaffa in Palestine in 1854 and were resisted by the indigenous Palestinians who attacked their colony in 1858 and killed a number of them, the US dispatched the steam frigate USS Wabash to the shores of Palestine to pressure the Ottomans into prosecuting the killers. A similar action was taken 2 decades later by the Germans in defense of fanatical German Protestant colonists. During the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877-1878, German warships came to the shores of Palestine to defend the German evangelical colonists known as the Templars in case they were attacked. And in the process, the German consul forced the Ottomans to recognize the legitimacy of the Templars' colonies, which they had refused to do until then. Indeed, the Templars had hoped to turn Palestine into a Protestant Christian state and were expecting that it would be awarded to Germany at the end of that war. They were to be disappointed. When 3 decades later, during the 1908 uprising of the Young Turks in Constantinople, Palestinian peasants attacked the German colonies, the Germans dispatched a warship again to Haifa to defend the colonists. 2 months ago, and in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the 1973 war, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise invasion of the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights to liberate them from Israeli occupation, the recently departed Henry Kissinger, who at the time was US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, revealed in an interview the US thinking, which led to the largest transfer of arms in history until that date. I quote him, "We were determined from the beginning to prevent an Arab victory. We were absolutely convinced from the very first second that we would restore the status quo," unquote. Kissinger added that, quote, "We'd based our early discussions about the war on the fact that the military advantage was on Israel's side," unquote. When this did not materialize, it became necessary to heed the frantic Israeli requests for military resupply. The US indeed dispatched the aircraft carrier Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the Eastern Mediterranean to join the US carrier Independence, which was already stationed there. The US carrier John F. Kennedy was also ordered to join them. These were augmented by the massive US airlift of military hardware and Kissinger's advice to the Israelis on how to continue the battles with the assurance of US diplomatic support. These efforts were scaffolded by deeply racist, anti-Arab and pro-Israeli US media, which did the trick. The propaganda had it then, as now, that Egypt and Syria had invaded Israel itself, when in fact they had invaded Egyptian and Syrian territories occupied by Israel since 1967. Given the successful precedent, the Americans are hoping they can repeat their performance this time around as well. It is especially relevant in this context to point out that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is an old-time admirer of Kissinger. According to the Washington Post columnist Charles Lane, a Harvard classmate, when in college, Blinken approached Henry Kissinger for an interview for his senior thesis about the Trans-Siberian Pipeline. The fact that he would ask an interview respectfully with Henry Kissinger was like the epitome of being a moderate in our generation, Lane said, especially as he added, quote, "Most Harvard people of the early 80s wanted to meet Henry Kissinger so they could put him on trial for war crimes," unquote. The US media scaffolding for the solid US support for the apartheid regime has yet again been shamelessly in evidence from the moment the Palestinian resistance retaliated against Israel, with the usual hypocrisy and racialized sympathy for Israeli Jewish victims of war and silence on the far greater numbers of Palestinian victims. Like Kissinger before him, Antony Blinken pledged on the first day of the war to bolster Israel's security. He underscored the US's unwavering support for Israel's so-called right to defend itself. Claims of mass murder of babies and their decapitation, and of mass rapes of women, among others, were dispensed to a white supremacist Western world and Western mainstream media ready to believe any Israeli claim about the racially inferior Palestinians. The Western press immediately began disseminating Israel's claims as incontestable truth before quietly retracting many of them one by one, although President Joe Biden continues shamelessly to propagate these libels as facts. Israeli witnesses who testified that Israeli forces targeted Israeli civilians and Hamas fighters together, which led to the killing of both and the burning down of the homes of Israelis and of the bodies of Israelis and of Palestinian fighters, let alone the indiscriminate strafing of people at the music festival by the Israeli armed forces, or of cars occupied by Israeli civilians fleeing the scene of the fighting, did not inoculate the Western media and governments against these racist fabrications. This anti-Palestinian Western campaign, which includes Germany, France, and the UK, to support the Israeli settler colony, is as much in full swing now as it has been since 1948, and remains equally committed to defeat the anti-colonial indigenous Palestinians, come what may. The Germans declared to the Jewish supremacist leaders of Israel that Berlin is, quote, "on your side," unquote. France echoed the same sentiments, affirming that, quote, "we stand by Israel and Israelis," while the British declared that the UK, quote, "supports Israel." It is hardly a coincidence that these countries are either settler colonies themselves, as the US remains, or colonizing countries which had established white supremacist settler colonies: Namibia, Tanganyika, Rhodesia, South Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Kenya, to name a few, which of course they defended with much violence from the 1890s until the 1980s, when indigenous resistance finally upended them. After 140 years since the beginning of Zionist colonization of Palestine, and 75 years after the establishment of the Jewish settler colony, Israel's struggle to impose Jewish supremacy on the Palestinian people still requires it to murder tens of thousands of Palestinians. That almost a century and a half after the beginning of colonization, Palestinians have continued to resist their Zionist tormentors with all their might makes them fair game in the eyes of Israel and its Western allies for Israel's genocidal killing machine. The Zionists have run out of racist aphorisms with which to describe the Palestinian people and have reverted to the same old tired ones used by the earlier generation of Zionist conquerors. Benjamin Netanyahu's description of Israel's current war of annihilation against the Palestinian people as, quote, a war between forces of light and forces of darkness, between humanity and animalism, unquote, as with all his previous racist gimmicks, lacks originality. It was the Austro-Hungarian founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, who described the future Jewish settler colony as early as 1896 as forming, and I quote, the portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, unquote. The Belarusian head of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann, in turn, described the Palestinians in 1936 as, quote, the forces of destruction, the forces of the desert. And he described the Jewish colonists as, quote, the forces of civilization and building. Weizmann had in fact described the resistance to the Zionist conquest of Palestine as, quote, the old war of the desert against civilization, but we will not be stopped, unquote. Such genocidal and racist descriptions are hardly exclusive to Zionism. They are typical of all colonizing peoples. When the French conquered New Caledonia and put the indigenous Kanak people who survived the killings in reservations after stealing their lands, Kanak resistance to French genocide was described by the French as a war, quote, of savagery against civilization, unquote. When Britain invaded and occupied Egypt in 1882, it called its war, quote, a struggle between civilization and barbarism, unquote. Similar examples from the colonial archive abound. Netanyahu, of Polish origins, is not alone in his racist fulminations, but is rather typical of all of Israel's leaders, who, like former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, of Lithuanian origins, referred to Israel as, quote, a villa in the jungle, unquote. Or Israel's current defense minister, Yoav Gallant, of Polish origins, who described the Palestinians on the third day of the current Palestinian-Israeli war as, quote, human animals. As for the religious rhetoric that the secular or so-called secular Zionists have always used to justify their conquest of Palestine, it is never far from Israel's official rhetoric. Netanyahu's enjoining his colonial troops as they go on their mission to annihilate the Palestinian people to, quote, remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, unquote, is the latest such invocation. The Jewish God had commanded his people to, quote, now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys, unquote. Netanyahu appears to be applying this commandment to the Palestinian people. Netanyahu's invocations are part of the mythical Zionist linking of colonizing European Jews to the ancient Hebrews in order to indigenize themselves in Palestine. Such Zionist mythologies, however, contradict the very biblical narrative on which they rely, which tells us that even the ancient Hebrews were not indigenous to Palestine, but conquerors of the land of Canaan. This is what once led Edward W. Said to title his response to this bogus Zionist narrative, quote, a Canaanite reading, unquote. To conceal the nature of the Zionist conquest and the bloody history of the Jewish colonists in Palestine, Israel and the Western media have regaled us with the abhorrent claim that the October 7th Hamas offensive is, quote, the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. I'm seeing things. Oh, okay, sorry. Can you still hear me?
ahead, Professor Massad.
All right, thank you. I was interrupted by some strange messages. I wasn't sure.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
To conceal the nature of the Zionist conquest and the bloody history of the Jewish colonists in Palestine, Israel and the Western media have regaled us with the abhorrent claim that the October 7th Hamas offensive is the deadliest attack on Jews, quote, since the Holocaust, unquote. The active Israeli and Zionist attempt to portray Palestinians as anti-Semites and as Nazis goes back to the 1920s and the 1930s, respectively. The point of the current despicable propaganda is to transform the Palestinian struggle from an anti-colonial one into an anti-Semitic one to gain Israel world sympathy. To frame the Israeli soldiers and civilians who died on October 7th as victims of anti-Semitism has the explicit aim of hiding the fact that when Palestinians attack Israel and Israeli Jews, they attack them as colonizers, not as Jews. The attempt to exonerate Israel and its Jewish settler citizens from the crime of settler colonialism and racial supremacy by comparing them to European Jews who were solely targeted by anti-Semites because they were Jews is not only itself anti-Semitic, but also tars the memory of the fallen Jews during World War II as somehow associated with the Jewish supremacist settler colony of Israel, which the Palestinians resist on account of its racial supremacy and settler colonialism, and not its Jewishness. The imputation that the Palestinians would not have resisted their colonizers had they been Christian or Muslim or Hindu, and that they only resist them because they are Jews, risks absurdity. The renaming of Palestinian resistance to the destruction of their land, livelihoods, and lives as anti-Semitism also informs the recent racist US horror at the use in pro-Palestinian demonstrations of the chant "From the river to the sea," which the Zionists also want to tar with a brush of anti-Semitism. The chant "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," means that all historic Palestine should be freed from Jewish supremacist colonial and racial privileges, and that all Israeli racist institutions and laws should be abrogated from the river to the sea so that Palestinians will be free. That even the softer Israeli apartheid system, which operates inside Israel against its Palestinian citizens, has moved in the last 2 months to one akin in its draconian repressive measures to the one operating in the West Bank, where pogroms against Palestinians by Jewish settlers and the Israeli army are ongoing, seems irrelevant to those who malign the slogan. Those who object to the chant, especially the ones amongst them who claim to support a two-state solution, insist that they support the overthrow of the Jewish supremacist Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, but strenuously object to the overthrow of Jewish supremacy in Israel itself. What these Zionist arguments ultimately argue is that a core part of Jewish identity today is instituting Jewish racial supremacy over non-Jews and colonizing other people's lands, and that anyone who opposes either of these values is an anti-Semite. What is anti-Semitic, however, is the Zionist and Israeli projection onto Jews and Jewishness, the core values of settler colonialism and Jewish supremacy, which form the core of Zionism, but not of Jewishness or of Judaism. The Western governments and media consensus in defense of Israel today, while surprising to some, is no different from the Western consensus in support of European colonists and against colonized indigenous people since the beginning of European colonialism. The beloved French Democrat, Alexis de Tocqueville, had the following to say in the 19th century on French colonialism in Algeria. I quote him, "I have often heard men whom I respect, but with whom I do not agree, find it wrong that we burn harvests, that we empty silos, and finally that we seize unarmed men, women, and children. These, in my views, are regrettable necessities, but ones to which any people who want to wage war on the Arabs are obliged to submit," unquote. As for the liberal icon, John Stuart Mill, he was explicit that, quote, "despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians." During the German genocide of the Herero people of Namibia, German Social Democrats were just as racist as German conservatives and liberals, In responding to the dehumanizing description of the Herreros by conservative and liberal parliamentarians alike, who considered the Herreros inhuman beasts, August Bebel, the leader of the German Social Democrats in parliament at the time, while sympathetic to the struggle of the Herreros, agreed that they were not civilized. I quote, "I have repeatedly emphasized that the Herreros are a wild people, very low in culture," unquote. The surviving French communists who were exiled to New Caledonia to reform them after their 1871 Paris Commune uprising was put down by the French state also actively participated in the genocide of the indigenous Kanak people. Again, the entire political spectrum of the French, of the British as it is today, of mainstream US politics agree on these kinds of racist characterization. Some social media commentators have wondered how some Israeli Jews could stage a music festival merely 3 miles from the Gaza concentration camp, where scores of them were killed on October 7th. Others explained that outdoor nature parties or music festivals in Israel's wooded valleys and southern deserts are a popular pastime among young Israelis. But this is hardly unique to Israelis. A white South African attorney general in the then South African occupied settler colony of Namibia stated in 1983 that the white public, and I quote him, haven't the foggiest idea what's going on in the operational area where Black resistance was ongoing. Whites in the South, he said, continue to have parties. Historians of the Namibian struggle explained that the fact that settlers were used to turning a blind eye to rebellion in Black suburbs 5 miles from their homes, it was small wonder that whites of the region ignored the havoc nearby and held parties. The remarkable thing about the contemptible Western anti-Palestinian consensus today is the fact that the Western Academy, which had previously been a mainstay of pro-Israeli advocacy, has in the last 40 years debunked all of Israel's central Zionist claims, beginning with Zionist claims to the land of the Palestinians and ending with its claims that its so-called democracy, its master race democracy, if you will, applies to all. But none of this has had any effect on Western governments or media representations of Israel or of the Palestinians. This is especially true in discussions of hostage-taking. The question of taking civilians hostage to bargain for the release of prisoners is indeed an Israeli innovation. The practice was in fact introduced in the Middle East or in the world at large by none other than Israel. It was in December 1954 when Israeli fighter jets hijacked a Syrian civilian airliner in order to capture hostages for exchange with 4 Israeli soldiers who had been captured in Syria after they infiltrated the border a few days earlier. The then Prime Minister of Israel, Moshe Sharet, stated in his diary that the US State Department informed him that, quote, "Our action was without precedent in the history of international practice," unquote. As Syria's refusal and international condemnation of Israel at the time prevented any exchange, Israel launched a raid on Syria a year later, in December 1955, killing 56 Syrians, including 3 women, and abducted 30 Syrians as hostages to exchange for the 4 Israeli soldiers. The US was then shocked, quote unquote, by Israel's criminality and backed a strong UN resolution that condemned Israel's violation of the armistice lines. The Syrians finally agreed to the exchange in March 1956. While taking civilians hostage is deemed an illegal act, the attempt to present the Palestinians as pioneering barbarians in this regard for having carried it out when the civilized Israelis not only introduced the practice, but have in their dungeons upwards of 9,000 abducted Palestinians, including 85 women and 350 children, some of whom have just been released in the latest exchange, and more than 3,200 of whom were abducted by Israel from the West Bank and East Jerusalem since October 7th alone, is part and parcel of this ongoing propaganda. Since 1967, Israel has held the entire Palestinian people who live in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem hostage. Since 2005, it incarcerated those in Gaza in the largest open-air prison in the world, and now is slaughtering them unless they agree to self-expel. The West's condemnation of Hamas for taking Israeli civilians hostage as barbaric reaffirms the utter hypocrisy of the so-called universal values of this racist liberal West, especially so as the number of Israeli hostages is minuscule compared to the number of Palestinian civilians abducted by Israel before or since October 7th. It is the Americans, the Brits, and the Europeans who should instruct their own nationals who are illegal colonial settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to vacate the occupied territories and repatriate to their mother countries. In 2017, it was estimated that about 65,000 American citizens were colonial settlers in the West Bank alone, 15% of the total settler population at the time. This is not counting settlers in East Jerusalem. The American settlers constitute almost a third of the 200,000 American settlers living in Israel and the occupied territories. Many amongst them consider themselves liberal, left-leaning, and are educated professionals. Moreover, Israeli officials told the Washington Post a few days ago that 10,000 Americans were recalled to military duty from the US to partake in Israel's war of annihilation, most of them dual nationals. The fact that at least 1 million Israeli Jews hold European and US nationalities should impel the US and European countries to invite them back to their home countries to ensure their safety, and so that they can make room for the indigenous Palestinians of Gaza, whom their colonization had displaced in the first place, so that they can move back to their original homes and lands in Israel in accordance with international law and UN resolutions. The United Nations Secretary General and his minions would not dare make such demands in private or in public to the Americans and the Europeans, let alone to Israel. Yet these reasonable demands, which are in line with international legitimacy, would contribute to ending Israel's belligerent insistence on maintaining Jewish racial supremacy and settler colonialism in the land of the Palestinians. The continued use of a discredited Orientalism and Orientalists, not to mention fanatical pro-Israel Zionists as advisors and informants to governments and media, including those of the now departed Bernard Lewis and others after 9/11, whose views had been discredited since the 1970s, shows the adamant commitment of Western political power to white supremacy and its insistence that only Orientalist Zionism and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism will be sought out to help imperial ventures. What this commitment demonstrates clearly is that only Western academic knowledge that furthers empire and white supremacy is recruited to support imperial ventures, while anything that could distract from imperial goals is unsurprisingly deemed irrelevant or aggressively discredited and censored. In the meantime, the scale of Israel's savagery since October 7th has superseded its previous barbaric wars. The Zionist onslaught in 1947 and 1948 to conquer Palestine killed upwards of 13,000 Palestinians. More than 11,000 were civilians. This is not counting the 3,700 other Arab soldiers and irregulars who were killed in the war. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 killed upwards of 18,000 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. Israel's ongoing genocidal war in Gaza has killed so far upwards of 23,000 Palestinian civilians. By today's count, close to 16,000 are confirmed dead and more than 7,000 missing under the rubble. This, of course, outdoes Israel's previous carnage. Yet, in view of Israel's horrific history of atrocities against the Palestinian people, and especially the Palestinians of Gaza, who have borne its most cruel manifestations by being incarcerated in their concentration camp for almost 2 decades, many commentators have come up with various analogies to condemn or explain what transpired on October 7th. The liberal Palestinian-American historian Rashid Khalidi, who served as an advisor to the PLO in Madrid and Washington in the early 1990s on how to negotiate the Kissingerian so-called peace process, Khalidi was most condemnatory of the Palestinian resistance. Quote, "If a Native American liberation movement came and fired an RPG at my apartment building because I'm living on stolen land, would that be justified? Of course it wouldn't be justified. You either accept international humanitarian law or you don't, unquote. Khalidi's analogy is grossly mistaken. Had the colonized Palestinian citizens of Israel, not of Gaza, bombed Israeli Jews who now live on their stolen land, the analogy with Native Americans might have some merit, but even then, it would partake of the racist white settlers' representation of Native Americans in the US Declaration of Independence as, quote, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, unquote, as Nick Estes of the Native American organization Red Nation reminded Khalidi in response. In contrast with Khalidi, the American Jewish historian Norman Finkelstein, whose parents were concentration camp survivors, likened the Palestinian resistance to Jewish inmates breaking out of concentration camps and bursting the gates, as he put it, and how his own mother had supported the indiscriminate bombing of German civilians in Dresden. Many other analogies abound. But in the meanwhile, Khalidi made no inapt analogies with the massive support the Israeli public is giving to the annihilation of the Palestinians in Gaza. According to the Israel Democracy Institute and Tel Aviv University's Peace Index, polls taken more than a month after the beginning of the massive Israeli bombing of Gaza, which by then had killed thousands, 57.5% of Israeli Jews polled said that they believed the Israeli army was using too little firepower in Gaza. 36.6% said that it was using an appropriate amount of firepower, while just 1.8% said they believed that the Israeli military was using too much firepower, unquote. The horror that Israel and its Western sponsors have felt since the October 7th Hamas offensive stems from the racist contempt which led them to believe that Israel could never be militarily defeated. This is not an unprecedented situation. In 1896, the Italians, who had set up a settler colony in Eritrea, decided with British encouragement to invade Ethiopia to acquire more land, only to be humiliated and defeated by the French-armed Ethiopian army of Emperor Menelik II. Thousands of Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Italian soldiers were killed at the Battle of Adwa. The defeat of a European army by an African army left Italy humiliated before its European peers and seeking revenge, which, however, had to await the arrival of fascist rule. This was not the first time European colonizers were defeated by indigenous Africans. The British had already been massively defeated by the Zulu Kingdom's army almost 2 decades earlier at the January 1879 Battle of Isandlwana in southern Africa, where despite the superiority of British weaponry, the 20,000-strong, lightly armed Zulu army humiliated the British colonial forces, killing 1,300 troops out of a total of 1,800 soldiers and 400 civilians, which was the size of the invading force, whereas the Zulus suffered between 1,000 to 3,000 dead. British pride in tatters and fear by the Israeli government that the Zulu victory would encourage indigenous resistance across the British Empire, the British set out to re-invade Zulu land in July 1879 with a much larger military force. They defeated the Zulus this time and exacted revenge by sacking the Zulu capital Ulundi, razing it to the ground, and they captured and exiled the Zulu king. 2,500 British troops and 10,000 Zulus were killed in the process. There was also the Sudanese leader, Muhammad Ahmad bin Abdullah, known as Al-Mahdi, whose army conquered Khartoum from the British colonizers and defeated their forces in January 1885. Al-Mahdi died in August 1885 of typhus. Sudan, however, would not be reconquered by the British until 1896, and Khartoum not until 1898. The European colonial tradition of decapitating native leaders, however, would continue even in death. British conqueror Lord Kitchener ordered the exhumation of Al-Mahdi's body, decapitated it, threw the body in the Nile, and thought of using the skull as an ink pot, were it not for the instructions that later came from Queen Victoria upon hearing of the abomination. As for the Italians, it was Mussolini who avenged the defeat at Adwa when he invaded Ethiopia in 1935. This time, the Italians killed 70,000 Ethiopians and transformed Ethiopia into a settler colony, at least until Italy's defeat during World War II. Khalidi acknowledges, as Palestinian historians and revolutionaries have done since the 1920s, that Palestinian resistance to Zionism is an anti-colonial one. Yet this does not deter him from condemning Palestinian resistance. Rather than deploying incoherent fictional analogies, as Khalidi the historian does, we must always, and not just selectively, situate the West's racist rage and Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinians within this historical colonial lineage, which explains the context of Palestinian resistance to Israel's war on this captive people. As Israel is the last settler colony in Asia and Africa that continues to be ruled by racially supremacist laws and institutions, the West views its survival as Europe's and the US's last stand in support of racism and settler colonialism outside their borders and against the barbaric hordes of non-Europeans resisting colonial rule and determined to overthrow it. Our world continues to be divided more than ever between the forces of white supremacy, led by the US and Western Europe, and their non-white victims. Israel's ongoing genocidal war crimes in Gaza are only the latest in a long history of colonial atrocities to safeguard white European supremacy in the last settler colony in Asia and Africa. This circling of the Western wagons aims to prevent the achievement of Palestinian freedom, no matter the cost. But what the white supremacists refuse to concede is that the Palestinian people will not stop resisting Israel until its apartheid and Jewish supremacist regime is defeated and political equality and a true decolonized, non-racialized democracy are achieved. Thank you.
So another question we had was about the kind of moving forward specifically with consideration for a one-state solution, two-state solution, and assuming that Israel is not successful in what, at least to me and many other observers, seems to be an intent and a genocidal intent and an ethnic cleansing motivation to literally get rid of 2.3 million Palestinians and put them, cleanse them or push them, displace them into Egypt, which is no secret. The state of Israel has made that clear for decades. But the Palestinians and the Egyptians, at least thus far, the Egyptians are rejecting it. So assuming that the Egyptians continue to reject it and there is no war or military reality that forces the Palestinians into into Egypt, what do you see is the options for the future that are feasible and that would be would comport to the values that you discussed today, that underpin kind of your anti-settler, anti-Jewish supremacist values?
Well, first of all, of course, as many have pointed out for years, that there is already a one-state solution, right? So it's one country. It is run by a Jewish racial supremacy and an apartheid regime that functions differently in different parts of the country. In East Jerusalem, it has different regulations than in the West Bank or than in Israel proper or in or around Gaza. However, as the three or two major Western human rights organizations, usually organizations that have been or had been enamored of Israel for decades, but who finally came out with reports in the last couple of years describing Israel or accusing it of the crime of apartheid or of being an apartheid regime, as did a major Israeli human rights group. We understand that this is there's already a consensus in the human rights community as to the nature of the Israeli regime. And this is even before the current right-wing fundamentalist government had taken office. So this only, I would say, increased in terms of the determination of the rulers of Israel to even increase their hold on power and increase their regulations. So what is feasible? It is very feasible, of course, to dismantle all the institutions and the laws that privilege Jews ethnically, religiously, and racially over Palestinians, and maintain Jewish supremacy and settler colonialism if the Western supporters would, in fact, stop supporting this regime, and the United Nations would be allowed to impose international law on Israel. That kind of transition could, in fact, take place, and it will not take place as part of negotiations, but as part of actual economic and political sanctions on Israel, if the international community would will it. But as we see, all the colonial, former colonial, and current neo-colonial powers in Western Europe and the US not only are supporting Israel under the table, but are actually proud of supporting its apartheid and genocidal policies, and insist that its victims, it's the 1,200 people who were killed during the attack, are more valuable than the 23,000 Palestinians who have been killed. So the question remains one of white European supremacy, which abets European and Jewish supremacy in Israel. This is the major impediment to any change or transformation. And the idea that remains, the kind of ideological lie that European Jews in Israel, or Jews in general, remain victims of the anti-Semitic European regimes that victimized them during World War II. As if Jews, when they moved from Europe to Palestine, they maintained the same status. The idea that Jews had actually transformed from refugees into colonists, somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean before they arrived, is always subtracted from these considerations. People forget that in 1948, more than a third of the Israeli army consisted of Jewish Holocaust survivors. These are people who actually committed huge massacres and atrocities against the Palestinian people. So the Palestinians have a different relationship to the history of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Those who remained in Europe or came to the US and survived did not partake in the onslaught on the colonial onslaught on the Palestinians in 1948. These are, of course, these facts are readily available in Israeli scholarship and even in Western scholarship. Yet they're often glossed over in any discussions that demand that the Palestinians remain always in solidarity with their victimizers and not in any way criticize them.
So this brings us to the Arab countries. And the situation is quite different in 2023 than it was in 1967 and then it was in 1973. And we've had some questions as to what your analysis is with regard to the Arab states, and obviously they're different and they're not all the same. We know that Saudi Arabia seemed to be getting quite close to finalizing the Abraham Accords or some form of normalization, at least openly. There were rumors that they were already normalizing relations behind the scene with Israel. And we also know about the 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. So how do you analyze the role of the Arab states or the Middle Eastern states in the current war, siege, genocidal slaughter that's going on in Gaza by the Israelis?
The majority of Arab states, while publicly critical of Israel after 1948, had in fact been or had good relations with it either before 1948 with the Zionist leadership or afterwards. So we know, for example, that the Emir Abdullah of Jordan and the Emir Faisal of Iraq had early relations with the Zionists since 1919 onwards. We also know that the Jordanian King Hussein and the Moroccan king both had sort of secret relations with the Zionists since the 1960s. We also know that even the Tunisian and the Sudanese nationalist movement had contacts and relations with the Israelis at the UN since the 1950s. The idea that somehow, or that the Saudis and the Omanis and the Israelis had relations during the Dhofar revolution in Oman, back also in the early 70s, or even during the Yemeni war in the 60s. So there have been a number of different kinds of relations that existed unofficially, or perhaps officially, but rather secretly, over the decades. However, since the late 1970s, we do see much more open normalization on the part of Israel, on the part of Jordan, much more recently on the part of Morocco, Sudan, and even for a short period, officially yet now stopped, Libya, but also Bahrain, and of course the United Arab Emirates. So these are now open diplomatic relations, but even those countries that don't have open open diplomatic relations continue to have different kinds of relations, which is, for example, the Saudi example you gave, or even the Qataris who've been instrumental in the recent negotiations about the hostage exchange. So I do believe, as many reports have shown us, that many of these Arab governments are now in quite a bit of a quandary. On the one hand, their populations are very supportive of the Palestinian resistance against Israel and against continued normalization, whereas their commitment to being subservient to U.S. diktat and U.S. sort of instructions make them unable, even if they chose to, oppose U.S. policy on this question. So they will only, of course, oppose certain kinds of U.S. policies if they realize that if implemented, these U.S. policies would unseat them. So, for example, the Jordanian and the Egyptian government strongly objected to the American request, surreptitious initially, American request to allow the expulsion of the 2+ million Palestinians to Sinai. It was their refusal to abide by this instruction that led to the U.S. retraction of that request and to much more open declarations that the U.S. allegedly does not support the expulsion of Palestinians, even if it supports, finances, and supplies their killers with the weapons to kill them. At the moment, I think there's some difficulty that many of the Arab regimes are facing, especially if Israel does not achieve an unquestionable victory, but also a different kind of quandary if it does. So on the one hand, of course, the Arab governments now realize that Israel really has been a paper tiger, that's been scared of a military power that True was able to defeat 3 Arab armies in 1967, but could not defeat the Palestinian guerrillas in 1982 for about 2 months. And now it could not actually and cannot seem to score a single military victory over a Palestinian guerrilla movement that was formed within a concentration camp with no access to the outside world over the last 18 years, except, of course, for its victory in annihilating the Palestinian civilian population and the civilian infrastructure, including, of course, schools, 2 of which were bombed this morning, killing many of the refugees in them in southern Gaza, but also, hospitals, even sort of the Palace of Justice, mosques and churches, etc. So the absence of any Israeli military victory, except in its barbaric bombing of civilians, does not, inspire confidence in Israel's abilities, and the fact that it required the imperial power par excellence, the US and others, to come to its aid on the first day, has convinced, of course, everyone that the Palestinian war for liberation is one that is being staged against the United States, that sponsors Israel, and not against Israel proper. That the Israelis themselves could not have maintained their settler colony and their racially supremacist regime for the last decades had it not been for US help and European help. And even on their own, they cannot sustain it.
We have another question, a few questions about the psychological or psychoanalysis dimension of the complete denial of the humanity of Palestinians. It is jarring aspects of being in the United States, and perhaps it's similar in Europe, but when you read the mainstream media, it's as if it's in a completely different reality than when you read the social media coming out of Gaza with pictures and videos and we call direct evidence of war crimes by Israel. And something is deeply, deeply racist or psychotic or dystopian about even the failure to recognize that these are in fact human beings and that they're being killed at such a high rate. 2/3 are women and children. And as we know, at least the militant branch of Hamas is not women and children. So even if you were to argue this was some form of a lawful military,
or old people for that matter, and the elderly have also been have formed a large part of the casualties.
right? So people who clearly are not members or they're not combatants in any kind of war or military conflict. So what is happening? How is it that you have people who, whatever their identity is, whether they're Jewish or Christian or Protestant Catholic, but it is remarkable how they don't even have the basic human empathy to realize that whatever Israel's military objectives are, what they are doing is medieval. It's something that we are not supposed to see since World War II. And if it did happen, it was usually because we didn't know about it until it was too late, which is not the case here. We are literally witnessing it alive. So what's your psychoanalysis of that, whether it's based in the US or the Western countries in general?
I don't think this is unique. I don't think it's medieval, actually. I believe it is very modern. And I don't think it's very different, say, I mean, usually commentators and historians of World War II tell us how the majority of Germans were sunbathing and swimming on beaches in September 1939 as the Nazis were invading Poland. They forget to tell us that in 2003, most Americans were also at bars having drinks and watching the bombing of Baghdad. So in that sense, I think the dehumanization of people that deserve to be killed is very, very old. We've seen the history of the animalization of African Americans in this country to make their oppression and their murder acceptable. People used to send postcards from the South showing with pictures of lynched Black men to each other in the mail. So the dehumanization of Jews by anti-Semitic regimes, and not only the Nazis, also the Polish and the Romanian regimes of the 1930s partook of that kind of dehumanization. The dehumanization of the natives of Africa, of the Americas, of Oceania. I don't think this is anything special, really. It is only special in that it is the latest that we've seen in terms of this horrific dehumanization of people. But we've seen that previously. We've seen the attempt to cover up the amount of atrocities in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we've seen it previously in the attempt to cover up the atrocities in the Israeli invasions of Lebanon, etc. So I think it is very much part of the racist psyche that it could only understand empathy with other European populations, and it considers non-European populations not really human, and therefore would not have sympathy or empathy with them, as they're always disruptors of white supremacy and the white way of life. It does not really need much psychoanalysis of race. Excuse me. The 19th century concept of race, or race itself is a 19th century concept in its biological sort of meanings, and it would begin to be deployed more and more against non-white Christian Europeans in the second half of the 19th century. It was in the late 1870s that we begin to see the rise of racial hatred of Jews and the emergence of this new term called anti-Semitism, right? Previously, the hatred of Jews was much more religious and not racial. The anti-Semites were very specific in the 1870s when they said that they actually opposed Jews not for their religion, but as a race, that even if they converted to Christianity, that would not erase their racial characteristics. Remember that Nazi Germany would also incarcerate Jewish converts to Christianity, even if you had to go back 3 generations. But so even if your parents had converted to Christianity and you were a Christian, you still went to the concentration camp, right? Because for Nazi Germany, it was a question of race. Of course, we know today that the biological notion of race is a bogus notion, that in fact there is no scientific notion of race. People across different epidermal markers have much more genetic similarities than people who allegedly belong to the same sort of color or epidermal markers. So, however, so since I do not believe in race, I do not believe that there is, in fact, a European Christian race either, any more than I believe that there's a European Jewish race. However, the fact that racism begins to isolate people in Asia and Africa and in the Americas and Oceania, as well as European Jews as outside of this, but even East Europeans. Remember, the Nazis also considered Slavs inferior racially. So all of that actually begins in Europe. But after World War II, we begin to see an increasing, or even in the US during World War II, we begin to see the rise of something new called the Judeo-Christian. This is something which is quite anti-Semitic. After all, Christianity is built on the negation of Judaism, on the negation of many of its key aspects, and of course has annexed the Jewish scriptures to its so-called Holy Bible. Nonetheless, the idea that now that suddenly there's a book that was written in the early 40s in the US about the sort of like the religions of democracy, being Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. This is, of course, new because anti-Catholic sentiment in the US was also endemic historically. But the fact that there was an attempt to bring about whiteness, to expand the purview of whiteness after World War II, at least in social understanding and cultural understanding, if not in genetic understanding, is interesting. Although we begin to see in the last 30 years a complete reinvigoration of the scientific notion of race. As we know, there are some people today who are looking for the Jewish gene. This, for me, is a Hitlerian project, of course. Anyone who claims that Jews are genetically Jewish is in the lineage of racial anti-Semitism and in the lineage of Nazism. But the European Jewish founders of Zionism have always and had always allied themselves with European Christian racists and supremacists. And as I've quoted to you, they spoke of themselves as Europeans. They understood that they were not equivalent to European Christians within Europe, which is why they never demanded that their settler colony or that their Jewish state be located in Europe at the expense of European Christians. But they also understood that they were white in relation to Africans and to Arabs, which is why they had several choices of where the settler colony could be located. They considered, for example, Uganda or the highlands of Kenya. In fact, they considered even Angola, Libya. They considered Australia, Suriname, as well as Palestine, Cyprus, the Sinai, etc. So, all their locations that were considered were always in places that were inhabited by non-white people. If you see the correspondence between Zionist leaders and European colonial secretaries, especially of Britain, usually, or even diary entries, Theodore Herzl would write something like, if I could show the colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain in Britain, a space in Africa or Asia that is not yet inhabited by white people, we would then be able to talk about it. So there was an understanding that Jews were Europeans, they were carriers of European civilization, And then this is why, until today, the Israeli reigning ideology tells us that not only is Israel European, is a villa in the jungle, but that Israelis are in the Middle East, but not of it. Right? This is very important for Israel. A few years ago, there was a scandal when Israel's ambassador to Australia spoke in a speech and said how Israel and Australia are the only two white nations in Asia. So the idea that Israelis, especially European Israelis, consider themselves of a different stock, if you will, and this is racism that was also practiced against non-European Jews, not only against Palestinians. So when I speak of European, of white supremacy or of Jewish supremacy as an adjunct to it, I'm not speaking about actual races, but about ideologies, right? So, and the fact that the Zionists decided to ally themselves with the persecutors of Jews, and this is not only after World War II. Remember, Theodor Herzl had written explicitly about this, both in his books and in his diaries. He said, and I'm quoting, "The anti-Semitic countries will be our friends. The anti-Semites will be our allies," right? So, and this is something, a dictum that the Zionist movement have always used, allying itself with anti-Semitic forces, as Israel does today. And the fact that the Israelis after World War II, or the Zionists after World War II and after 1948, allied themselves with the same European powers who until that moment denied Jewish refugees entry, but allied themselves with them against the Palestinians, tells you that they are allied themselves with their own or the oppressors of Jews in order to be able to oppress another people of color, the Palestinians, and they can now be somehow annexed to Europeanness. And that was the idea. Zionism was based on the idea that unlike assimilated Jews who believed Jews could be French and German and American as they had been, the Zionists said, no, that they could not be, not in Europe. The idea was that in Europe, the Zionists would say, the Jews would remain Asiatic, but in Asia, they would become European. They were not wrong. Today, they are considered European also by the Americans and the Europeans, which is why they support them.
Now, can I just add one follow-up? Because we've seen this question here and in other contexts. What about the Sephardic Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, the Yemeni Jews, the ones who are physically Arab presenting? How does that fit into your analysis?
I've written on this also extensively, in fact, but it fits in the sense that we have a history of the racism toward non-European Jews within the Zionist movement early on and after 1948, and the role that the Zionist movement played in bringing about their arrival in Israel, how it put bombs in Iraq and synagogues to scare them into thinking they're being targeted by Iraqis, how it forced the Iraqi parliament to pass a law to allow Iraqi Jews to leave to Israel. Otherwise, it would block a World Bank loan to Iraq that Iraq had applied to at the time, or the attempt to bring about Egyptian Jews from Egypt also by having or by sponsoring a terrorist operation in 1954 called Operation Susanna, or known usually after the scandal came out as the Lavon scandal or the Lavon affair, when a few Egyptian Jews were recruited to put bombs in cinemas and post offices and at the train station, implicating other Egyptian Jews. So we know the history of that, but also the discriminatory practices within Israel after Israel brought about the exodus of Arab Jews to its settler colony. And the discrimination was huge, from small things like cultural things, subsidizing European-style bread and refusing to subsidize, for example, Iraqi or Egyptian or Yemeni bread, because that was foreign, even though Mizrahi Jews were the majority of Jews in Israel. The consideration of Israeli music, meaning European, especially East European music, as national music, whereas Mizrahi music as somehow the music of the Mizrahi communities, as if they're minorities. The consideration of Polish Jews as Westerners and Moroccan Jews as Easterners, even though Morocco, of course, is way west of Poland, etc. So we have, but of course, the immense poverty, denial of education, accommodation, living quarters, denial of access to the land that was stolen from the Palestinians, giving them substandard land while giving the Ashkenazim the better lands, putting them in sort of militarized towns on the borders so that when Palestinians resist and try to come back to their homes, they would attack them, and then they would actually hate Palestinians themselves. So there was a big and very detailed history of this. However, as soon as Israel is confronted with a war with the Palestinians or with other Arab countries, it imposes on Mizrahi Jews immediately sort of a condition where they cannot protest against Ashkenazi discrimination. We saw this in the early 70s when there was a mass movement called the Black Panthers after the American Black Panthers, which staged demonstrations day after day for years. All of it stopped in the 1973 war because Golda Meir threatened the Black Panthers leadership that they would be considered traitors to Israel if they continue to actually protest the Israeli government as the Arabs, quote unquote, are attacking it. So again, the idea that we're all Jews, so Arab Jews have Jewish privileges over the Palestinians, but the Ashkenazim also have European privilege over them in addition to Jewish privilege. So it's a gradations of the kinds of power that you have, and this is not. I mean, we've seen this in other contexts. We've seen how South Africa treated different populations. The British initially, the English had more rights than the Afrikaners, and the Afrikaners began to have more rights. The Indians and the coloreds began to have some rights, but the blacks did not, etc. So the kind of gradations of racial power where you can be complicit in an apartheid regime is something Israel is very well practiced in.
Thank you so much, Professor Massad, for your insights, for your deep expertise, for your courage to speak truth to power, and your courage to be an independent that is not basing your analysis on whether some university president or even the United States president or any organization approves or disapproves of your analysis. We need more critical thinking and independent thinking in the academy. What we've witnessed over the last 2 months in the United States is how fragile academic freedom is, and how thin the commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of thought and academic freedom is in the United States. I hope that those who listen to this brilliant presentation and who are learning about the tragedy that's happening in Gaza will make sure that you continue to defend the principles and the practices that allow us in the United States to speak freely and to think freely. And that can't be based on whether we agree with the analysis or we agree your colleagues, your neighbors, your friends, your family members, your supervisors, your coworkers who are betraying those principles, because that is the one silver lining that we have, is that we are exercising those freedoms as much as we can. And I will remind everyone, if you found this lecture to be informative, if you appreciate the work of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, please make a donation. We rely on private donors. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and give generously. I also encourage you to read our groundbreaking report called Presumptively Anti-Semitic: Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, which is also available on our website. And finally, please join us this week. We have 2 more Palestine related events. Tomorrow we have a teach-in on the West Bank and Jerusalem, and on Friday we have a teach-in on Israeli settlements in the occupied territory. Both will be delivered by Dr. Zachary Foster, and you can register on our website. But I want to thank you so much, Professor Massad. We're so fortunate to have you here speaking with us and teaching us, and you have many supporters, and as you said, this is an intergenerational struggle, and we must be persistent, and we must be principled in how we support the underprivileged, the oppressed, the censored, and the millions of Palestinians in Gaza right now who are being victimized by a genocidal war.
Thank you, Professor Aziz, for inviting me. And it's an honor to be here, but I do want to say one last thing. I'm not speaking truth to power. Power knows the truth. I'm speaking truth to people from whom the truth is always being hidden and concealed. I write as a pedagogue, as a teacher, to teach those people who do not know the truth because it's being hidden from them what's happening. Power knows the truth. Power at universities, in the White House, and in Congress, and in the big corporations, they do know the truth, which is why they would like to suppress it when it's spoken. I thank you again.
Thank you. مع السلامة.